From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
In historically speaking, something that comes up surrounding the Salem witch trials is the notion of environmental contamination. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to get a little deeper in that, but first I'm going to read this email from Tanisha. Hello, I just finished listening to the Screaming Girls of Malaysia episode, and I'm really surprised that possible environmental toxicity wasn't mentioned. Surely outside investigators have tested the drinking water, air pollution, and soil, and I would love to hear about it. I thought you were going to bring it up after you mentioned the witch trials, because I know that a common modern theory is that people were having hallucinations due to, this is said to be the drinking water here in the email. Anywho, thanks for putting out a great show, Tanisha from right here in Atlanta. And this is an interesting thing because it's definitely not something that I don't believe this is a definitive answer, Ben, to what caused the witch panic, the satanic panic.
Yeah, ergotism, right?
Ergotism. And that wouldn't have been water. It would have been, maybe so. It was something in corn, right? Isn't it something that breaks down and becomes almost a hallucinogenic substance? Or it's a plague of sorts that can affect crops, I thought. But
yeah, it's a fungus. So there's a nod to it in one of the best horror films that came out recently, The Witch, where the produce is contaminated. It can cause a condition called ergotoxicosis. Really what's happening is people are ingesting the alkaloids produced by this fungus, which is called Claviceps purpurea, not the best name. It infects rye and other cereals, and it can cause things like convulsive seizures and spasms, diarrhea, and it can cause mania, psychosis. It can also cause a really gross kind of dry gangrene. It's been proposed that something like that could partially explain the outbreak of mass hysteria in Salem at that time. But I would also, I would draw attention to the idea of St. Anthony's fire. This was probably ergot poisoning. That's a theory where it seems much more likely than the speculation for Salem. So St. Anthony's fire is called that today because it was named after monks at the Order of St. Anthony. They were considered to be very successful at treating this kind of gangrenous poison, which would cause, it would just cause pandemonium. I mean, imagine you're already tripping balls, basically.
Right.
And then you see other people who are afflicted, but their physical bodies are changing. Like they're seizing up, arms are swelling or freezing.
Right. Yeah. And the young girls that I mentioned, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, were the sort of patient zero, I guess, of the Salem witch explosion, this kind of like massive spate of witchcraft accusations. And they were exhibiting symptoms very similar to that. They had convulsions and, essentially reporting having visions of sorts. And you're not kidding, Ben, when you say this stuff makes you trip balls. It actually, it's fascinating the way this stuff works. It can infect rye, the grain that you grow, that you can make bread out of. And the way it works is this fungus, this ergot fungus, can grow and actually replaces these shoots of grain from these ryes, for lack of a better way of, I am clearly not a farmer. Grass. Okay. Grass. Thank you. There you go. With something called scurlotia. And scurlotia is a persistent, according to the Britannica, a persistent vegetative resting spore of a certain fungi. And there's another great article in Britannica that talks about the whole potential for this ergot poisoning in the Salem witch trials. It forms typically after a severe winter and a particularly damp spring. And this whole theory was put forth in 1976 by Dr. Linda Caporael of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and found quite a bit of evidence that this could very well have been what happened, that this was a case of contaminated rye. That would have been, made into all kinds of foodstuffs, including bread.
Yeah, there are some issues. You're right. 1976. That's the first serious proposal we have about this theory. In 1982, another historian, Mary Matosian, talks about this as well in an article in American Scientist. There are a couple issues. Before we get to Malaysia, we promise you, we're on the way to Malaysia here. Before we get there, one of the issues with the Salem witch trial, as far as this explanation goes, is that ergot poisoning has additional symptoms that were not recorded in Salem. Right. There's some of this stuff. We know that it can cause mental breaks and it can have these cognitive effects, but more people would have been affected by ergot poisoning, from what we understand. It would be likely, at least, that more people in the town would be affected and that they would exhibit some more of those physiological symptoms of ergot poisoning. That's not to say this didn't happen. It's just to say that there would be additional symptoms and that the number of children who were afflicted, because we have to remember a lot of Salem, we're talking about children, there were fewer of them that would have been affected in any other ergot poisoning epidemic that we know of. And this does put us in a great spot to ask about Malaysia too, because this is something I was wondering when we were prepping this episode, different ways to explain this. We spend a lot of time in the episode, for anyone who hasn't heard it yet, exploring the sociocultural lens through which people experience these things. And then we don't spend very much time talking about possible environmental contamination and what it could be. So it's not rye bread, that's for sure, but it could be ergot transported through some other sort of vehicle, some other sort of carrier. But reading about pollution in Malaysia,
exactly,
we find that it does have a very high level of air pollution. It's unfortunately not uncommon these days, but that would appear to have impact on things like the lungs and the heart more so than mental function.
That's right. I will say, though, I did find, and this is a little over my head, but I found a report on contaminants and the soil environment in Malaysia from Y.M. Kanif and S. Salmeja from a larger paper called Contaminants and the Soil Environment in the Australasia Pacific Region. And there is an abstract. We're talking about how Malaysia's, undergoing a lot of very quick development and rapid industrialization, and agriculture is a big part of that. And there's a lot of very fast growth in the agriculture sector, and along with that comes increases in urban populations, and creations of new urban areas, and along with that, sometimes industry outpaces, what's the word, Ben? Oversight or regulation, right? And so there is a list of contaminants in the soil of Malaysia, and there's a particularly interesting column that talks about peninsular Malaysia, and it does appear that it does contain some pretty high levels of some contaminants. They're divided up into Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah, and Sarawak. And I did notice that in some of these categories, the number for Peninsular Malaysia that had contaminations in the soil and in the water from these tests that were in some areas markedly higher than in the other regions. Some of the specific contaminants that are listed, I am not familiar with, and they're certainly not household names. So I would definitely want to do some more digging into that. But it does have to do with things that are specifically found in the soil and that could be considered contaminants. So, and then I found an article in looking into this about how contaminants, well, maybe don't make you trip or, have some kind of like psychotic episode. Just basic environmental contaminants can have an effect on your mental health and just
like
your
lead?
well-being. Like lead, absolutely, Ben.
I want to say also in support of the point you're making, we looked into drinking water in Kelantan as well, because it seemed like that would be a good place to start. Like that would be one of the most ubiquitous common vehicles of transporting a contaminant would be the air, the water, or as you said, the soil. And I didn't find evidence of a hallucinogenic agent, but we do know, to the fantastic point you just raised there, Noel, something doesn't have to immediately make somebody mentally unstable for it to have a long-term cognitive effect. This is where we introduce something that may be familiar to our fellow listeners. As a matter of fact, some of us may be listening to this conversation and saying, I can't believe they're not going to talk about lead contamination and crime. This is related, if only tangentially. There is a long-running proposed link between elevated blood levels in children as they're developing and increased rates of crime later in life. We know the facts about lead. It's toxic. It's dangerous to multiple organs, in the brain especially. And individuals who are exposed to lead at young ages do seem to be more vulnerable to learning disabilities, decreased IQ, ADHD, lifelong problems with impulse control. So now there are experts who are proposing that lead contamination may have a possible long-term effect on various communities. There's still, you can see how that research gets complicated and very sticky very quickly. You'll see other studies contradicting it, but one of the reasons I think the question about environmental contamination in this case of the Screaming Girls in Malaysia is such a good question is exactly that. We do not understand the long-term effects of these, we don't understand the long-term effects of these contaminants. We could say with reasonable certitude that it's probably not ergot poisoning specifically, because of the way people were affected and the length of time they were affected or when they recovered, etc. But we simply cannot rule out some possibility of an environmental contaminant. That's where I'm at least. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you, Ben, and I want to just double back really quickly. The study that I mentioned at the top of the show, it was very in depth and dealt with a lot of different types of, acidity and different soils and stuff. So I don't want to couch that as evidence that necessarily that Peninsula Malaysia has higher rates of contamination than the rest of the country. But I will say I did find an article that does say that Malaysia has significant water pollution problems, and that does stem from that rapid industrialization that I talked about, that study referenced. I mean, that holds true. But it points out that Malaysia doesn't actually release individual values of river water quality measurements for monitoring sites. It just releases it kind of on a spectrum in 3 rankings: clean, slightly polluted, and polluted, but won't really give you a breakdown of what materials are in the drinking water. So I think this is something that we probably owe it to ourselves and the listener to maybe revisit another time. But I do think that you're right, Ben. This is not something we can absolutely rule out.
Agreed on all counts here. And thank you for raising this important point, Tanisha. Also, I believe that you are a fellow Georgian So it's great to hear from the hometown crew here as well. This is something that we are going to have to spend some time exploring. So I don't know what anybody else was planning for this weekend, but don't invite me to your parties because I am going to be reading a lot about environmental contamination in different parts of the world.